I would like to start by thanking everybody in the museum for this incredible contribution, help, collaboration we had over the past several months or even a year. It is not easy to do an exhibition like this, and I think we managed to do something that I hope you will appreciate, and I hope you will find inspiring and enriching. I also would like to endorse the land acknowledgement that Bob read out, and I would like to complement that with a portion that refers to another, for us here, important kind of reference. So we also acknowledge the participation of Brown's founders and benefactors in the institution of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the benefits that Brown University derives from them. Given the topic of the exhibition, which is about forced migration, it is important, I think, to recall and remember that specific episode in human history. But I also would like to have an informal labor acknowledgement and acknowledge all the people who worked manually for this exhibition, even the people who came in this morning at 4 o'clock to clean the gallery that you're actually going to experience in an hour. It is important to have both land and labor acknowledgement side by side. So as Bob said, I'm going to start by giving some context to this exhibition, talking a little bit about Lesbos, our work, and how that led to the exhibition. And then my co-curators are going to continue with brief interventions on their own participation. So I'll start with a vignette that refers to the people I'm working with, people who we are calling now migrants. But we have to remember how these terms work in terms of kind of separating and in terms of creating otherness. So I met him first in January 2017. He was a late 20s man from a West African country who after several months found himself on a Greek border island not far from the Turkish coast, the island of Lesbos, that is. He left pursuing his dream, but he also left because of political persecution in his own country. He was politically active, he tells me, but I should have guessed anyway, because his oratorial skills were impressive and are impressive. His party was the main opposition party in the country, but he himself seemed to have also been involved in political feuds with opponents, including members of his extended family. He arrived to the islands on a speedboat along with many others, wearing one of the life vests produced in small backstreet workshops on the Turkish coast. They would, however, proclaim these life vests to be known brands like Yamaha or at other times Yamaxa with X, as you can see, I think here. Obviously of questionable standards and buoyance, as I will explain and will show you later in the exhibition. So I first met him in a January afternoon on the port, and he was one of the few people, mostly from West Africa, who had agreed to leave the tents in the overcrowded and freezing detention center for an old warship docked on the port, at the port of Mytilene. This ship had been sent by the Greek government, to operate as a temporary shelter in the midst of one of the heaviest winters for decades. Most other migrants refused to stay in the ship, fearing that this is an elaborate ploy. They want us in the ship so that they can actually deport us back to Turkey, they told me. My interlocutor showed trust, fearing that his body would not be able to cope with the snowfall had he stayed in the tent. While in Istanbul, he tells me, I found myself almost in a war zone with all the bombs that they were going around. It was a time when there were many bomb attacks in Istanbul. And I thought that I had left all that behind when I left home. He was clearly worried and concerned, but also determined. He had already developed links with many others, especially people from Africa. In this jungle, he tells me, all Africans are brothers. I saw him again 6 months later in July of that year. He was back in the main detention center, not in a tent this time, but in the prefab container, the famous or infamous ISO boxes, as migrants call them, shared with many others, of course. But the camp time, the time of waiting, had taken its toll. His application for asylum had been rejected, and he was about to appeal. As with all migrants on the island, he was allowed to leave the camp, but not the island itself, while his case for asylum was being considered. His most important possessions while there, along with his smartphone, were some pieces of paper, some original, some photocopied. He showed me some of those papers kept safe inside plastic sleeves. Several of them had to do with his situation back home, evidence that he was chased by the police, medical examinations, other kinds of documents. Others had to do with the situation on the island. Above all, a piece of paper identifying him as someone who had gone through the initial process of registration and is applying for asylum. Like others, he had to produce that piece of paper regularly, going in and out of the camp, but also going to the town. I had seen even bus conductors on the island asking to see that piece of paper, asking for identification, although it wasn't their job, to issue a ticket. The border is not by definition a static material reality. It is a situation, an instance, a relationship. You don't leave it behind when you cross. You carry it with you. He started losing hope and confidence in the whole process. He was considering whether or not to apply for an appeal. His lawyers were very good, he tells me, but too few for the many thousands of cases. Rather than exhausting each case, he tells me, they are exhausted by them. I saw him at his happiest when he was able to connect with refugee rights activists and participate in workshops held on the island. He would tell me about political mobilization inside the camp, expressing at the same time suspicion and distrust for some of the so-called community leaders, that is, the go-betweens appointed by each nationally defined migrant community with the encouragement and the support of camp authorities. Our conversation continued online months after I left the island and he stayed behind. Some days, he'll be the first to send me a message on Messenger. Good morning, sir. I respond and I'm waiting. There is nothing, just good morning, sir. Or maybe that was enough for him at that moment. At the end, he decided to take the risk, leave the island clandestinely, and continue his journey to the mainland. I don't feel safe here, he would write to me regularly. From the mainland, he wrote to me a few times. He considered staying in some of the squats and solidarity structures in the mainland, but decided against it, fearing again that these too would be raided. He was continuing his journey, but the border was traveling with him. I lost contact several months after it. There were a few messages that had arrived at the middle of the semester, one of the busiest times for me, and I could not respond immediately. When I tried to contact him later, there was no response. I could see that he was still active and that he was even posting political messages, in his own language. And in the last attempt to contact, I realized that he had actually decided to keep a very low profile, even blur or cover his own digital tracks. I don't know what's the current situation with him. He could be still living somewhere clandestinely in the mainland, in Athens or elsewhere, could move on and try to continue his journey to other European countries, or he could have been arrested and already deported. I have decided to start my talk today with some of the recent fieldwork kind of notes I've kept, not only because I think they help me introduce some of the main themes for us today and for the exhibition, but also because I wanted to conjure up the presence amongst us of the people who produced some of the material realities of this exhibition, who shaped the assemblage of migration we are about to experience. I could have also talked to you about the young man I met a couple of years ago and with whom I spent an agonizing couple of hours trying to find his cell phone, which he had lost. And that's important, I think, on the way from Mytilene to the Moria camp. The man was from Gaza. And as he was showing to me his ID issued by the Greek authorities, stating that he's not allowed to move out of the island, I was reflecting on the irony. He escaped a homeland which had become for him an open prison, to cross into Europe and find himself again imprisoned on an island while waiting for his asylum application to be processed. Or I could have talked to you about my friend from Pakistan who fled fearing for his own life and who became a chef on Lesbos while waiting for the asylum process to be completed. I can testify to his culinary skills, to the care he put to it, especially for his chicken biryani, which I tasted and is amazing. A friend from whom I've heard only a couple of days ago, as the new Greek government promised more and faster deportations, he tells me that the decision for him was negative, and he was fearing arrest and imminent deportation. As he said to me on chat 2 days ago, I will be killed if I'm to be sent back to Pakistan. I could have also talked to you about another friend of mine, this name with a real name because he's openly active out there, Farzad Zakria from Afghanistan this time, who arrived on Lesbos about a year ago with his wife and 5 children, fleeing persecution and the bombs in Kabul, which, as you know, there are daily instances. Farzad, he can still hear the screams of a mother who lost her 10-year-old daughter, Roya, on the short crossing from Turkey to Greece. Farzad, however, went on to found one of our collaborators for this exhibition, in fact, the Waves of Hope for the Future. You can see him here in the middle. He started single-handedly teaching children in the open air amidst the chaos and the desperation of the largest and perhaps the most brutal refugee camp of Europe, Moria. Now, the organization, Wave of Hope, has been embraced by many migrants, mostly from Afghanistan. It teaches more than 1,000 children and adults and runs even a small library. And I would invite you to contribute to this library if you want. And an art school. And you will see some of the work of this art school and of the artists of this organization in the gallery. And by the way, this is Farzad at the Acropolis in Athens. Very interesting. And this is from his public profile on Facebook. It's not something I took from private kind of records. And I think this evocative message should stay with us for a while. I could have spoken for hours about these people and many more besides. They should have been here with us tonight, but they cannot. Some passports do not pass many ports. I'm an anthropological archaeologist, and the exhibition we're about tonight to see relies on an archaeological project, or rather a project of archaeological ethnography. That is a shared space between archaeology and sociocultural anthropology. It is an ongoing project which started in 2016, a project which attempts to understand the phenomenon of contemporary forced and undocumented migration by using our archaeological skills and methodologies and by placing emphasis on the two key concepts for archaeology, materiality and temporality. It is at the same time a project of activism and public intervention, an archaeology of witnessing and an archaeology of care. I'm not, of course, the first to embark on such a project, and many of you will know that our colleagues, let's say, working on the Mexico-US border, have attempted such a project for some years now, and you may know the names of Jason De Leon and his team, Randy Maguire and Ruth Van Dyke, or Gabriela Soto. And these have shown to us how fruitful and politically important such an archaeology can become. Bob already referenced this specific book called The New Nomadic Age, a collective book that actually includes many contributions by many people from around the world on this topic. But it was important for me to use the term New Nomadic Age to actually convey the message that this kind of work and this kind of archaeology is bound to become more important in the future. And I think the exhibition we are having today and it's going to be topical and important for the years to come. Now, the geographical and geopolitical context for this exhibition is the extensive borderscapes that range from the Canary Islands to the Greek-Turkish border, in some cases even all the way up to the Scandinavian border of the European Union. In its southern perimeter, it is mostly a liquid border, save for the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. These borderlands, of course, have come to public prominence and attention in the past few years, and especially since 2015, due to what has been called the migration crisis. A crisis that is linked often to the debt and the financial crisis that many southern European countries have faced in the past year, especially since 2010. But the term migration crisis, which I always put in inverted commas, needs to be contested. Others, such as my political scientist colleague in Greece, Dimitris Christopoulos, suggest it's not in fact a migration crisis, but a reception crisis. A reception and hospitality crisis of the global north, which hints at a deeper, perhaps identity crisis. While the media in the past few years have been focusing on the Syrian exodus, it is easy to forget that migrants from Africa and from many Asian countries have been attempted to cross into Europe for as long as there are border controls and passports. In the past decades, such attempts have intensified, not only because of the increasing warfare and violence, including the structural violence of inequality and poverty, but also because many people in these countries have taken seriously our statements in the global north on the time-space compression, on globalization, on the shrinking of distances, allowing easy travel. This is what we've been saying, right? They have thus taken their lives on their hands, or better, on their own feet. Suddenly, the Greek-Turkish border, that is the border of the European Union, is a walking distance from Afghanistan or Pakistan. And Cameroon or the Congo is not far from the shores of Italy or Spain for those people. It is a global movement, thus. It is a global movement in both senses of the word, an embodied, sensorial and kinesthetic experience as people cross borders and countries. It is also a new kind of social movement that is reshaping our world. Above all, contemporary global migration from the global south to the global north makes colonialism present, reminds Europeans of their unfinished, ongoing, and often hidden or sidelined histories. Contemporary migration brings forth a haunting apparition, the ghosts of colonialism. It enacts a hauntology, to use a Derridean term here, an ontology of becoming in the new nomadic age. And yet, how have the European elites responded to this historical and existential challenge? And you can see here in this map some of these responses, and I'm going to say a thing or two in a minute. The answer to this question is in two ways. The first is to export the border, to push the border between the European Union and the global south further eastwards and southwards by funding buffer countries in exchange of stopping migrants reaching the Mediterranean shores. This has been happening for years, especially with the agreement, for example, between Spain and North African and East African countries. It also has been happening since 2016, March 2016, with the agreement between Turkey and the European Union, which actually relates to our situation on Lesbos. The second way is to materially produce a fortress Europe. In a sense, to abolish the border as a zone of contact and interaction, and reconstitute the border as a barrier, as a wall, as a razor wire fence. Walls, fences, even Frontex ships Even sea walls, which is the recent kind of, this is the wall on Evros, but this is a recent idea by the Greek government to actually have a floating barrier, a floating wall between Greece and between Turkey and the Aegean Islands, the Greek Aegean Islands. But these measures, however, do not stop and cannot stop migration. They are not even intended to stop migration. They regulate the flow. They produce new and more deadly crossings. Above all, however, they fuel the illegality economy. And by the way, talking about deadly crossings, this is a graph from an organization called International Migration Organization. And you can see the numbers of people who perish in the Mediterranean and the world. And you can actually see that the Mediterranean crossing is, in fact, the deadliest crossing in the world right now, surpassing many other crossings. And these are data just for the first couple of months, from January until now. And you can imagine how many there are in the year. You can see the dead and the missing by year here. You can see the numbers in the Mediterranean in this case. So, as I was saying, these measures, above all, fuel the illegality economy. And they participate in the spectacle of the border, in the material constitution of the border as a global stage, a spectacular political economy. This spectacle is addressed to both domestic, that is EU audiences, and the would-be migrants of the global south. To the first, it sends a message of security. The undesirables are kept out or locked up behind many layers of razor wire. At the same time, it attempts to maintain a delusion of a false sense of transnational European coherence and community, which, as we know, doesn't exist. The French philosopher Etienne Balibar knows, however, that borders are not only about divisions between nations, they're also about allocation and distribution. Partage is the word he uses. They, in a sense, claims to ownership. The rematerialization of the border, therefore, is also a renewed claim of ownership, of land, of resources, of heritage, against the perceived enemies who dare put such ownership into doubt. It is, in other words, a reaffirmation of the colonial order. As for the message sent to global would-be migrants, it is twofold. A warning on the difficulties of crossing. The implementation, in other words, of the lethal policy that in this country is called prevention through deterrence. And of course, the biopolitical shaping of the new European subject of the migrant or refugee as a frightened, docile and subjugated and thus easily exploitable alien. So it has implications in terms of the labor conditions and allocation of labor forces. The anthropologist Catherine Besteman, who I understand was visiting the campus today, goes much further and suggests that the current response towards migration by the global north amounts to a state of a new, militarized, global apartheid. An expression that actually underscores the racialized practices we witness at increasingly militarized borderlands, something which actually resonates with my own experience from the field and from many other studies. My own archaeological ethnography of contemporary and documented migration has focused on the border island of Lesbos, as I already mentioned. Now, this is an island that has experienced several waves of immigration in the 1920s from the Anatolian coast, which is only, as you can see, only a few nautical miles away and clearly visible at the time from the eastern coast of the island. In recent decades, the island has been one of the main points of entry from the European Union to the European Union from Turkey, following especially the closure or the securitization of the Evros border, the land border or the river border in the north. But it was in 2015 that Lesbos attained global prominence due to the Syrian exodus. In 2015 and 16, more than 500,000 people crossed through this island and continued, most of them at the time, continued their journey to the mainland and to many European countries such as Germany and Sweden and others. It was the brief moment when the European Union had allowed that free movement and opened the borders for a very, very brief period of time before they closed securely again. It was at that moment that this borderland became a global stage where the rituals of humanitarianism were enacted. So you had visits to the island by the UN Secretary, by many politicians and heads of states, by the Pope himself. Now, just a few visual impressions of the island to show you that it has been always a center for the movement of migrants, especially from the Anatolian coast. In fact, this monument celebrates and commemorates the early 1920s migration of people from the opposite coast. And in fact, the island was always a kind of multicultural, kind of heritage space. You can still see many monuments testifying to the multi-faith existence of the island for centuries. And this is the Ottoman Imperial Bank building, which is now a cafeteria. And this is a graffiti from the visit, as I said, for many visits that the island experienced recently, in this case, the visit by the Pope. The March 2016 treaty between Turkey and the EU reduced significantly the number of arrivals on the island, and new, more lethal crossings, such as the North African one, became much more prominent. Lesbos is less often in the news now, although it resurfaced again very, very recently. But the material and the experiential realities for migrants are far, far worse now than they were in 2015 or even 16. Anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, and others flocked to the island the last few years, and they have worked and continue to work on a number of projects focusing on migration. Yet, a thorough and intimate, affective understanding of the materiality and the experiential weight of the phenomenon is still, I think, lacking. Moreover, the over-reliance on oral testimony and accounts and on ethnographic interviews has showed, at least to me, its limits. I'm tired of talking, tired of saying the same things over and over and over again, and nothing happens. Several people, several migrants have told me. They're referring, of course, primarily to their asylum application process and the many kind of interviews they have to give to convince asylum officers for their case. But this could also apply to extended ethnographic interviews where you do narrate the life, you do narrate the story. So I'm suggesting thus that an archaeological ethnography that centers on things, on biographical objects, on materials as well as materiality, and also on time and on temporality, can be more fruitful, of course, alongside with, of course, verbal interaction with people. And I want to now very briefly talk about the two main contexts which became the kind of the main sites for our project and the main kind of sources of the material you're going to see in the exhibition. The first is the camp I already mentioned, the camp of Moria, that in fact started many years ago as a conscript training center, and now it is a major settlement. In fact, as I said, the largest refugee camp in Europe. This is the entrance, and here's some historic Google images to actually see the initial size to the left when it was still a Greek government and Greek army kind of conscript center, to the point when 2015 became a refugee camp or a migrant processing facility, to the recent years when it actually mushroomed to become a major settlement. So you have a walled section, and then you have a kind of outgrowth, an area around it that becomes an organic, basically, shanty town and a major settlement. And here is how it actually appears on drone images today. So the initial facility was meant to be for 3,000 people. Today, counting everybody who lives around it, we're talking about around 20,000. So from 3 to 20,000, of course, and the numbers grow because, as I said, they are geographically restricted. They're imprisoned on that island. They cannot leave while their case is being processed. So this has become a major focus for my research, and I keep going back to it, and I visit and revisit. And in 2017, Darcy Huckley and Miriam Rothenberg and myself tried to do some study of its actual configuration, especially the walled part, and understand its complexity, because it is a very complex artifact that in fact embodies many different functions. Detention, registration, processing, as well as kind of settlement and habitation. So all these things are embodied and included in that specific kind of locality. But one of my main points of this kind of study and of the exhibition is that this specific locality is now being shaped by the action, the social action and the agency of migrants themselves, right? Given that the official authorities and even the NGOs cannot really cope with a number of people and cannot provide even the basic needs for these people, people have taken action and initiative and actually they construct their own shelter, they prepare their own food, they have developed a whole market inside and outside Moria. They have, as I said, organized themselves in makeshift schools, even studios and art kind of facilities. Food is a good case. We could talk for hours about how the central distribution of food through a catering company is a disaster of major proportions. Imagine having to cook for 20,000 people 3 times a day, and how tasteless and how useless this food can be. People say to me, this is food for ill people, people who are ill. And I can understand the sensorial and affective impact of that specific statement. And I even tasted this food and I can testify that they're absolutely right. So people have actually produced their own structures to cook and cater for themselves, even to the point of adopting chapels outside, especially the Christians from Ethiopia and from East Africa, adopting with the consent of the local community chapels who become, places of worship for themselves. And finally, this is a place of political organization and rioting and uprising. This is a photo that was sent to me from 2017, when there was a major uprising, especially by African migrants. It was, of course, dealt with extremely harshly by the police. This is some of the tear gas was used against them, and 35 people were arrested and were actually detained for years in this case. There are demonstrations even weekly. This is from one of the last kind of demonstration on Lesbos only a couple of weeks ago. Again, tear gas was used extensively against them by the police authority. And the second side is the so-called Life Cemetery, from which you will see many objects in the exhibition, and refers to a dump with thousands and thousands of live vests, but also other artifacts, and many boats that people use to do the crossing from Turkey to Greece. This, interestingly, has become a site that has become extremely visible recently, even almost a dark heritage space. So when we were there in 2017 with Darcy and Miriam, we could witness people coming and taking photos and treating it as a heritage space, which is interesting in as I said, in many ways. And we carried out a point survey to record it, and we even did a small excavation to actually try and understand the constitution of it as a space and the materiality of artifacts, many of them who are now upcycled by migrants themselves into bags and to other objects. And you will see some of them in the exhibition. So I want to stress that this is a collaborative exhibition. This is an exhibition that relies on the work of migrants themselves and their own organizations, but also on the work of a series of other small NGOs, and you can see their names here, and you can actually also access their website and donate their work in the gallery. So I want to finish by outlining the 3 main principles that actually shape the exhibition as you will see it. The first is that while borders exclude and racialize, they also produce illegality, but they produce also new subjectivities. They are thus expansive locales of immense activity that bring about a relationship of inclusion and exclusion. So we wanted to show that new becomings, a new production of subjectivity at the border, not only the sense of securitization. The second is that migrants are also political agents in their own right, and they need to be dealt with as agents and not as people that deserve sympathy. The third is that the whole migration process, but also the border crossing, can be understood as an assemblage, as a kind of gathering, a confunctioning of heterogeneous material and immaterial elements. And that notion of the assemblage was also fundamental for us in how we organize the exhibition. So, as a conclusion, what does it mean to hold an exhibition like this today in this specific settler colonial context? How can we show both the tragic dimensions of the militarization of the border as well as the agency of migrants? How can we foreground the affective power of materiality without objectifying people and aestheticizing, museifying objects? So these are some of the starting questions, but also some of our agonizing concerns. And we did go through agonizing concerns and kind of soul-searching while we're doing this. Whether we have addressed these issues successfully will be up to you to tell us. But I suggest that one way of avoiding museification and aestheticization is for the exhibition space to become an active, lively arena for teaching, for debate, for critique, even for activism and organizing, amidst the affective, energizing presence of objects, things, images, and words that we all assembled for you. So this is an invitation for you all to treat the exhibition in such a way. Thank you.